Everyone in Dry Creek laughed when the old veteran inherited a useless hole in the rocks. Until his German shepherd started digging at a sealed stone wall that no one had touched for decades. Walter Boone had spent years living quietly on the edge of town, carrying the invisible weight of a war most people had long forgotten. When a distant relative left him a piece of land deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, the townspeople thought it was nothing more than a cruel joke. Just a narrow canyon full of broken stone and dust. But Walter's loyal German shepherd, Atlas, refused to leave one strange wall of rock alone. What the dog heard behind that wall would soon change not only Walter's life, but the fate of the entire town. Before the story begins, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. The wind that moved across the flats outside Dry Creek sounded like a distant freight train, low and endless, sliding over miles of sagebrush and red dust. It rattled the thin metal siding of Walter Boone's trailer and made the loose screen door tap softly against its frame. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee grounds, old leather, and the cedar oil Walter used on the wooden table he had built years ago with his own hands. Walter Boone was awake. He was usually awake. Sleep had not been a reliable companion since the war. At 69 years old, Walter moved slowly, but there was still something in the way he carried himself that hinted at the man he had once been. His shoulders were broad, though slightly stooped, and his hands, scarred, thick, and steady, still looked capable of lifting more than most men half his age. He sat at the small kitchen table, staring out the narrow window that faced the open land beyond town. Beside his chair lay Atlas. The German shepherd was nearly as large as a small wolf, his coat a mix of deep brown and black that caught the morning light in soft streaks. One ear stood perfectly upright, while the other bent slightly at the tip, a small imperfection from an old training accident years earlier. Atlas's amber eyes never drifted far from Walter. When Walter shifted in his chair, Atlas lifted his head immediately, watching him with the quiet focus of a soldier waiting for orders. Walter reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. "You're the only one in this town who still listens," he muttered. Atlas's tail thumped once against the floor. Dry Creek was a small place. Fewer than 800 people lived there, most of them ranchers who had spent their entire lives among cattle, dust, and wind. Outsiders rarely stayed long. Walter had arrived nearly 20 years ago. He had come quietly, no family, no plans, just a man with a military duffel bag and a dog that had once belonged to the army. Over the years he had taken odd jobs, repairing fences, hauling lumber, fixing broken water pumps on nearby ranches. The work kept food on the table and silence in his days. But the nights were different. Sometimes they came without warning. Walter would wake suddenly in the darkness, his chest tight, his breath short, his heart pounding like artillery in the distance. And Atlas would already be there. The dog always knew before Walter even opened his eyes. Atlas would place his head gently across Walter's chest, his warm weight grounding him, reminding him where he was. Not in the desert, not in the smoke, not in the past. Just in a small trailer outside Dry Creek. On this particular morning, the sky was pale gray, and the wind carried the promise of another dry day. Walter poured coffee into a chipped mug and sat back down at the table. Atlas rose and padded across the room, his nails clicking softly on the worn linoleum floor. He stopped beside the door just as a truck engine approached from the dirt road outside. Walter looked up. Visitors were rare. The truck stopped. A moment later there was a knock. 3 firm taps. Walter stood slowly. Atlas moved with him, silent and alert. When Walter opened the door, a man in a dark suit stood on the step. The suit looked expensive, but dusty from the road. The man's gray hair was neatly combed, and he held a worn leather briefcase in one hand. "Mr. Walter Boone?" the man asked. Walter studied him for a moment before nodding. "That depends," Walter said. "Who's asking?" The man gave a polite smile. "My name is Richard Halpern. I'm an attorney out of Boise." Atlas stepped forward slightly. Not aggressive, just present. Halpern glanced at the dog. "That's quite an animal you've got there." "He's family," Walter replied. The lawyer nodded and opened his briefcase. "I'm afraid I've come with some unexpected news," he said. Walter leaned against the doorframe. "At my age," he said, "most news is unexpected." Halpern removed a folded document and carefully smoothed it in his hands. "Do you happen to know a man named Samuel Boone?" Walter frowned slightly. The name stirred something distant in his memory. "My father had a brother named Sam," Walter said slowly. "Haven't heard that name in 40 years. Halpern nodded. "He passed away 3 months ago." Walter's face remained calm. "People tend to do that eventually." The lawyer gave a faint, respectful smile before continuing. "Mr. Boone left a will. According to that document, you are the sole heir to his remaining property." Walter blinked once. "That's odd," he said. "I met the man exactly once when I was 8 years old." Halpern folded the document again. "Nevertheless, he left you something." Walter waited. The wind outside pushed dust along the road. "What did he leave?" Walter asked. Halpern hesitated slightly. Then he said the words, 40 acres of land." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Where?" "About 9 miles east of Dry Creek," Halpern said, "in a formation locals call Devil's Throat." Walter stared at him. Then he chuckled quietly. "Devil's Throat," he repeated. Halpern nodded. Walter looked down at Atlas. The dog was watching the lawyer carefully. "Does this land have anything useful on it?" Walter asked. Halpern cleared his throat. "Well," he said carefully, "I'm told it's mostly a narrow canyon, very rocky, difficult terrain." Walter took the document from the lawyer's hand and glanced at the map drawn across the bottom. A thin crack in the mountains, stone walls, no roads, no water. He looked up again. "You drove all the way from Boise to give me a hole in the rocks?" Walter asked. Halpern gave a small shrug. "I suppose you could say that." Walter leaned against the doorframe again and stared out across the empty land. 40 acres of nothing. Even the coyotes probably avoided it. After a moment, he handed the document back. "Looks like Uncle Sam got the last laugh," Walter said. The lawyer closed his briefcase. "For what it's worth," he said, "Mr. Boone spent many years exploring that canyon." Walter frowned slightly. "Exploring it?" Halpern nodded. "From what I was told, he believed something valuable was there." Walter chuckled again. "Did he ever find it?" "No," Halpern said. Walter nodded once. "Figures." The lawyer tipped his hat politely. "Well, Mr. Boone, the property is legally yours now. What you choose to do with it is entirely up to you." He turned and walked back toward his truck. Walter stood in the doorway for a long moment after the vehicle disappeared down the dusty road. Atlas sat beside him. The wind moved quietly through the sagebrush. Walter finally looked down at the dog. "Well," he said, "looks like we just inherited a pile of rocks." Atlas tilted his head slightly. Walter scratched behind the dog's ear. "Want to go see it anyway?" Atlas's tail thumped against the wooden floor. And somewhere deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, far beyond Dry Creek, a narrow canyon waited in silence. A canyon sealed by stone. A canyon that had been hiding its secret for longer than either of them had been alive. Walter Boone folded the map carefully and slid it back onto the table beside his coffee mug. Outside, the morning wind rolled across the open land like a slow gray tide. The sky over Dry Creek was clear, the kind of pale blue that usually meant another dry day in the Bitterroot foothills. Atlas was already standing by the door. The dog had heard everything. Walter glanced down at him. "You ready for an adventure, old boy?" Atlas's tail moved once, slow and confident. That was answer enough. By mid-morning, Walter's old pickup truck was rumbling east along the narrow dirt road that wound through the hills beyond Dry Creek. The truck was nearly as old as Walter himself, its paint faded and its engine making a low, steady growl that echoed against the rocky slopes. Atlas sat upright on the passenger seat. His ears twitched at every sound. Dry grass rolled past the windows in long waves. Here and there, small ranch houses dotted the land, their barns leaning under decades of wind and weather. Walter drove quietly. 9 miles wasn't far, but the land changed as they went. The rolling pasture slowly gave way to rougher country. Red rock pushed up through the soil like old bones breaking the surface. Juniper trees twisted against the wind, their branches bent and hardened by years of dry seasons. Walter followed the thin line of the map. Eventually the road narrowed until it was barely more than a pair of dusty tire tracks cutting through the sagebrush. Then the mountains appeared. The Bitterroot Range rose in long red ridges ahead of them, the stone glowing dark under the midday sun. Walter slowed the truck. "There she is," he muttered. Atlas leaned forward, staring through the windshield. At first, it didn't look like anything special, just another broken stretch of canyon wall carved into the mountainside. But as Walter drove closer, he saw it. A narrow crack in the rock, barely visible unless you knew where to look. 2 towering sandstone walls leaned toward each other, forming a dark opening no wider than a small barn door. Walter pulled the truck to a stop. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. Neither man nor dog moved for a moment. "Well," Walter said finally, "that must be it." Atlas jumped down from the truck and trotted toward the canyon entrance. Walter followed more slowly. The air inside the canyon felt different immediately. Cooler. Still. The tall walls blocked most of the wind, leaving the narrow passage strangely quiet compared to the open land outside. Their footsteps crunched against loose gravel. The canyon was barely 30 feet wide at the entrance. The rock walls rose high on either side, streaked with dark mineral stains that looked like old rain marks frozen in stone. Walter walked deeper inside. Atlas moved ahead of him, nose low to the ground, sniffing every patch of dirt and stone. The canyon curved slightly after the first 100 yards, narrowing even more as it pushed deeper into the mountain. Walter stopped once to look back. From inside the canyon, the outside world had already disappeared. Only a thin slice of sky remained visible above them. "Cozy," Walter muttered. They continued forward. The ground grew rougher as they went. Large boulders littered the canyon floor, many of them broken from the walls above and fallen long ago. Walter stepped carefully around them. A faint breeze moved through the canyon, carrying the dry smell of dust and sun-warmed stone. After nearly 10 minutes of walking, Atlas slowed. The dog's ears lifted. Walter noticed immediately. "What is it?" Atlas walked a few more steps and then stopped. Walter came alongside him. And that was when he saw it. The canyon ended. Or rather, It had been sealed. A massive wall of collapsed stone blocked the passage completely. Huge boulders, some the size of small cars, had fallen together over the years, forming a jagged barrier that stretched from one side of the canyon to the other. Dust and sediment had packed between them, hardening the entire mass into something that looked almost natural. Walter stood quietly for a long moment. "So that's the end of the road," he said. Atlas didn't move. Walter stepped closer to the rockfall. He placed his hand against one of the stones. The rock felt cool, despite the warm day outside. The collapse looked old, very old. If someone had tried to clear it before, there was no sign of it now. Walter stepped back and looked up at the canyon walls. It was easy to see why people had given up on the place. There was no soil here, no grass, no water, just stone and shadow. 40 acres of nothing, Walter murmured. Atlas walked slowly toward the rockfall. His nose touched one of the lower stones, then another. The dog sniffed carefully, moving back and forth along the base of the collapsed wall. Walter watched him for a moment. "Go on," he said softly. "Check it out." Atlas continued searching. His tail was low now, moving slowly as he worked. Walter leaned against a nearby boulder and waited. After several minutes, the dog stopped. Atlas stood directly in front of one particular section of the rockfall. His ears stood straight. His body stiffened slightly. Then he did something that made Walter raise an eyebrow. Atlas began to dig. The dog's paws scraped against the gravel at the base of the stones, pushing aside small rocks and dust. Walter chuckled. "Easy there," he said. "There's about 50 tons of mountain on top of that." Atlas kept digging. Walter walked closer. "Atlas," he said. The dog stopped, but he didn't step away. Instead, he lowered his head and pressed his nose into the small gap between two stones. Then Atlas gave a low, quiet whine. Walter frowned slightly. "What is it, boy?" Atlas looked back at him, then at the rock again. Walter crouched beside him. For a long moment he simply studied the collapsed wall. Nothing looked unusual, just stone piled on stone. But Atlas wasn't moving. Walter reached out and brushed some gravel aside where the dog had been digging. The space between the rocks was small, barely wide enough to slide a hand inside. Walter pressed his palm against the stone. Cold, solid, silent. He pulled his hand back. "Well," he said, "if there's something behind there, it's been hiding a long time." Atlas sat down in front of the rockfall and refused to leave. Walter stood slowly. He looked around the canyon one more time. Dust, stone, silence. Then he glanced down at the dog again. Atlas was still staring at the wall. Walter sighed. "You stubborn old soldier," he muttered. Atlas's tail flicked once. Walter walked back toward the canyon entrance. After a few steps, he realized Atlas wasn't following. Walter stopped, turned around. The dog hadn't moved. He was still sitting in front of the rockfall, watching the stones with quiet intensity. Walter scratched his beard. "Well," he said slowly, "that's interesting." The canyon was silent again. High above them, a hawk circled lazily against the blue sky. Walter walked back toward the rockfall and stood beside the dog. "You think there's something back there?" he asked. Atlas didn't answer. He simply leaned forward and pressed his ear lightly against the stone and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. The canyon stood perfectly still around them. The high red walls held the silence the way a church holds a whisper. Even the wind that had followed them through the hills seemed unwilling to enter the narrow passage. Walter Boone watched the dog. Atlas didn't move. His head rested against the cold rock, one ear folded slightly against the stone, while the other stayed alert. His amber eyes were half closed in concentration. Walter crossed his arms. "You hearing something I'm not, partner?" Atlas remained there another 10 seconds. Then he pulled his head back. The dog stared at Walter, then turned back to the rockfall and gave a low, uncertain whine. Walter frowned. That sound wasn't fear. Atlas didn't scare easily. It was the sound the dog made when something puzzled him. Walter stepped closer to the wall of stone. The collapse looked even bigger from up close. Large boulders leaned against one another like the ribs of some giant animal that had died here long ago. Dust and time had cemented the cracks with hardened sand. A man could spend a lifetime moving rocks like these. Walter placed both hands on one of the stones and pushed. It didn't move. "Yeah," he muttered. "That's about what I expected." Atlas stepped forward again. He sniffed the narrow gap where two rocks met. Then he scratched at the ground once more. Gravel scattered across the canyon floor. Walter sighed. "Easy there," he said. The dog stopped digging, but his gaze never left the stone. Walter looked down at him. Atlas had always been a strange kind of dog. Most German shepherds were loyal. Most were smart. Atlas was something else entirely. Walter had met him 12 years earlier on a training base in Texas. The dog had been part of a military program designed to work alongside soldiers in rough terrain. Atlas had already been trained to track movement, detect danger, and respond to commands faster than most men could react. But there had been an accident during training. Nothing serious, just enough that the Army decided the dog was no longer ideal for active work. Walter had volunteered to take him. That was the beginning of everything. Since then, Atlas had rarely been wrong about anything. If he barked, there was a reason. If he refused to walk a certain trail, something was ahead. And if he sat staring at a wall of rock like this, Walter had learned to pay attention. The dog pressed his nose into the crack again. A faint breath escaped him. Walter crouched beside him. "What do you think, huh?" Atlas pawed the gravel again. Walter studied the stone carefully. From a distance, the collapse looked random, but up close, there were small spaces between some of the rocks. Dark, narrow seams where time had left tiny openings. Walter leaned closer. The rock smelled faintly of dust and dry earth. Nothing unusual. He pressed his hand against the stone again. Still cold. Still solid. Atlas sat down again and waited. Minutes passed. Walter finally stood. "Well," he said, brushing dust from his jeans, "I don't see much point standing here all day." He turned and started walking back toward the canyon entrance. After several steps, he realized Atlas wasn't following. Walter stopped. "Atlas." No movement. The dog was still sitting in front of the rockfall. Walter turned around. "You planning to move any time today?" Atlas tilted his head slightly, but he didn't leave. Walter sighed and walked back. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Atlas wagged his tail once. Walter looked at the rock again, then at the dog, then back at the rock. He rubbed the back of his neck. "You remind me of a lieutenant I had once," Walter said quietly. "Guy would stare at a problem until everyone else gave up." Atlas blinked slowly. Walter crouched again and leaned closer to the stone. "All right," he muttered. "Let's humor you." He pressed his ear against the rock. Cold, hard, silent. Walter stayed there a few seconds, then 10. Nothing. He was about to pull away when something strange happened. A memory flickered through his mind. Not from the war, from somewhere earlier. Walter straightened. What was that? He leaned in again, pressed his ear more firmly against the stone. The canyon remained quiet. Atlas stood beside him now, watching closely. Walter held his breath. And there it was. So faint he almost missed it. A low vibration. Not loud, not clear. Just the faintest murmur buried deep inside the rock. Walter pulled back slightly. Hold on. He pressed his ear against a different spot. Nothing. He moved his head a few inches to the left. Again. That same faint sound. Walter's eyes narrowed. It wasn't wind. Wind echoed differently. And it wasn't insects. Too steady. Too deep. Atlas gave a soft whine. Walter sat back on his heels. Well, I'll be damned. He looked down at the dog. You heard that, didn't you? Atlas's ears lifted. Walter stared at the rockfall again. The sound was subtle, almost impossible to notice unless you knew exactly what you were listening for. But it was there. A low, steady murmur. Like something moving. Walter felt a strange sensation crawl slowly up his spine. He leaned forward again. This time he listened longer. The sound rose and fell slightly. A soft rhythm. Walter whispered the words out loud before he fully realized it. Water. Atlas's tail thumped against the gravel. Walter pulled his head away from the rock and stared at the collapsed wall. Well now, he said quietly. That's interesting. He stood slowly and looked up at the massive pile of stone blocking the canyon. If water really was behind that wall. Walter let out a long breath. The thought sounded ridiculous. There could be nothing back there, just more rock, more canyon. But the sound had been real. Atlas stepped forward again and placed one paw against the stone. Walter chuckled softly. You think we should take a closer look, huh? The dog wagged his tail once. Walter stared at the rockfall. 40 acres of useless land. That's what everyone in Dry Creek would say. But suddenly, Walter wasn't so sure. The sun was beginning to slide lower in the sky above the canyon walls. Walter glanced toward the entrance. Tell you what, he said finally, we'll come back tomorrow. Atlas sat down again, still watching the stone. Walter started toward the truck. Halfway down the canyon, he stopped and looked back one more time. The rockfall stood silent and unmoving, just a wall of stone. But somewhere behind it, deep in the mountain, something was whispering. And Atlas had heard it first. Walter Boone didn't say another word as he walked back through the narrow canyon. The sound of his boots crunching gravel echoed faintly between the towering sandstone walls. Atlas followed closely beside him now, but every few steps the dog glanced back toward the rockfall they had left behind, as if something back there still had his attention. Walter noticed. Yeah, he murmured quietly. I hear it too, partner. But the truth was, he didn't hear it anymore. Not out here. The moment they stepped away from the wall, the faint whisper inside the stone disappeared. The canyon swallowed it like it had never existed. By the time they reached the truck, the wind had returned. It slid across the mouth of the canyon and stirred dust along the road. The wide Idaho sky stretched above them in pale blue silence.
Walter rested his hand on the truck door, but didn't open it. He stared back toward the canyon entrance. Atlas stood beside him, watching the same direction.
"You ever get the feeling," Walter said slowly, "that something's waiting for you to notice it?" Atlas tilted his head. Walter chuckled quietly. "Yeah," he said. "Me neither." They drove back toward Dry Creek as the sun dipped lower behind the Bitterroot Mountains. The long shadows of the ridges stretched across the land like dark fingers reaching into the valley. Walter didn't turn on the radio. He rarely did. The silence inside the truck felt more comfortable to him than most conversations. Atlas lay across the passenger seat, but the dog didn't sleep. His ears flicked at every shift in the wind outside. Walter's thoughts stayed behind in the canyon. That sound. Water. He had heard streams buried under rock before. During his time overseas, there had been mountain patrols where soldiers learned to listen for hidden springs in dry terrain. The sound carried strangely through stone. Deep, muted, but unmistakable once you knew what it was. Walter drummed his fingers lightly against the steering wheel. "That wall's been there a long time," he muttered. Atlas opened one eye. Walter glanced at the dog. "If there's water behind it..." He didn't finish the sentence. 40 acres of rock might still be worthless. But water in Idaho meant something, especially in a place like Dry Creek. The town had survived more than one dry summer by hauling water in trucks from 20 miles away. Walter drove slowly into town, just as evening lights began appearing in the windows of the small buildings along Main Street. Dry Creek wasn't much to look at. A gas station, a grocery store, 2 bars, a hardware shop, and a diner that smelled permanently of bacon grease and burnt coffee. Walter pulled into the gravel lot beside the hardware store. Atlas jumped down beside him. Inside, the bell above the door rang softly as Walter stepped in. The store smelled like sawdust and motor oil. Behind the counter stood Earl McGrady. Earl had run the hardware store for nearly 40 years. His gray beard and faded flannel shirt made him look as permanent as the building itself. He looked up when Walter entered. "Well, I'll be," Earl said. "Thought that was your truck out there." Walter nodded. "Evening, Earl." Earl glanced down at Atlas. "That dog's still smarter than most people I know." Walter smiled faintly. "Most days." Earl leaned forward on the counter. "What can I get you?" Walter looked around the store. His eyes landed on the rack of heavy tools along the far wall. Sledgehammers, steel chisels, pickaxes. Earl followed his gaze. "Planning to break something?" Walter walked over and lifted a sledgehammer from the rack. The handle was solid hickory. The steel head looked heavy enough to split a railroad tie. "Maybe," Walter said. Earl raised an eyebrow. "Need chisels too?" Walter nodded slowly. "Probably." 10 minutes later, Walter walked out of the store carrying a sledgehammer, 2 heavy masonry chisels, and a pair of thick leather gloves. Earl watched him load the tools into the truck. "What exactly are you fixing out there in the hills?" Earl called. Walter paused beside the truck. "Rock wall," he said. Earl chuckled. "Good luck with that." Walter climbed into the truck. Atlas jumped back onto the seat beside him. As they pulled away from town, the sky had turned deep orange behind the mountains. Walter drove home slowly. His trailer sat alone on the edge of a wide field where the wind moved freely across the grass. He parked the truck and carried the tools inside. Atlas followed him. Walter leaned the sledgehammer against the wall beside the door. The metal head gleamed faintly in the evening light. Atlas walked over and sniffed it. Walter poured water into the dog's bowl and sat down at the kitchen table. The trailer creaked softly as the night wind picked up. Walter stared at the sledgehammer. He could almost hear that faint whisper again. Water moving somewhere deep in the stone. He rubbed the back of his neck. "You're too old to start digging mountains," he muttered to himself. Atlas finished drinking and padded over to lie beside Walter's chair. The dog placed his head across Walter's boot. Walter looked down at him. "You started this," he said quietly. Atlas blinked slowly. Walter chuckled. "All right," he sighed. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear above the dark outline of the Bitterroot Range. Walter stood and turned off the kitchen light. Atlas followed him down the short hallway to the small bedroom. Later that night, the nightmare came again. The desert. The sound of distant explosions. The choking smell of smoke. Walter jerked awake with a sharp breath. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Then Atlas was there. The dog had already climbed onto the bed. His head rested gently across Walter's chest. Walter's breathing slowed. The room returned. The quiet trailer. The wind outside. Walter reached up and placed a hand on the dog's neck. "Thanks, soldier," he whispered. Atlas's tail thumped softly against the mattress. Walter stared at the ceiling in the darkness. His mind drifted back to the canyon, to the sealed wall, to the sound hidden inside the stone. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, Walter was already dressed. Atlas stood waiting by the door. Walter grabbed the sledgehammer. "Well," he said quietly, "let's see what that mountain's hiding." And somewhere deep inside Devil's Throat Canyon, behind a wall of stone that had stood silent for decades, the faint whisper of moving water continued patiently through the dark. Walter Boone returned to Devil's Throat Canyon just after sunrise. The truck rolled slowly across the dry dirt road, its tires kicking up thin clouds of dust that drifted across the sagebrush. The Bitterroot Mountains stood silent ahead of him, their red ridges glowing under the pale morning light. Atlas sat upright beside him. The dog had been restless since dawn, Walter could tell. The moment the canyon entrance appeared ahead, Atlas's ears lifted sharply. "Yeah," Walter said quietly. "We're going back." Walter parked the truck in the same spot as the day before. The wind was weaker today. The canyon mouth stood quiet and shadowed, the narrow opening between the stone walls looking almost like the entrance to a cave. Walter lifted the sledgehammer from the truck bed. The steel head felt heavy in his hand. Atlas jumped down and trotted toward the canyon without waiting. Walter followed slowly behind him. The air grew cooler the moment they stepped inside the canyon again. The tall sandstone walls blocked most of the morning sun, leaving the narrow passage wrapped in cool shadow. Their footsteps echoed softly. Atlas moved ahead at a steady pace, nose low to the ground. Walter could already see the rockfall ahead. The collapsed wall stood exactly as they had left it, silent, unmoved. Atlas reached it first. The dog immediately returned to the same place he had been digging the day before. His paws scraped gravel aside as he searched the small space between two of the larger stones. Walter set the sledgehammer down and stretched his back slowly. "Well," he said, "let's see if we're crazy." Atlas stepped back. Walter picked up the hammer. He studied the rockfall for a long moment. The collapse was massive. Dozens of boulders stacked together, packed tight with decades of dust and sediment. Clearing it would take time. Maybe a lot of time. Walter lifted the hammer. The first swing echoed sharply through the canyon. Steel struck stone with a hard crack. Dust fell from the rock. Walter lowered the hammer and studied the mark. The stone had chipped slightly. Not much, but enough. Walter nodded to himself. Good, he murmured. Atlas watched him closely. Walter swung again. The second strike rang even louder. The sound bounced between the canyon walls and rolled outward toward the distant mountains. Hour by hour, Walter worked. The sun climbed slowly above the canyon walls, sending thin beams of light down into the narrow passage. Sweat gathered along Walter's forehead. The sledgehammer rose and fell. Again, again, again. The stone slowly began to crack. Small fragments broke free. Gravel scattered across the canyon floor. Atlas stayed nearby the entire time. Sometimes the dog watched. Sometimes he paced quietly along the base of the rockfall. Once he barked sharply when a loose stone shifted unexpectedly. Walter stepped back just as a chunk of rock tumbled loose and crashed to the ground. "Good catch," Walter said, breathing heavily. Atlas wagged his tail. By midday, Walter had cleared a small section of the lower rocks. Not enough to pass through, but enough to see that the collapse wasn't completely solid. There were gaps deeper inside the pile. Walter sat down on a flat stone and wiped sweat from his face. His shoulders ached. His hands were already beginning to blister. Atlas walked over and sat beside him. Walter scratched behind the dog's ear. "You sure about this?" he asked. Atlas leaned his head against Walter's arm. Walter chuckled softly. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They rested for a few minutes. Then Walter stood again. The hammer rose. The stone cracked. The canyon filled with the sound of iron striking rock. The work continued through the afternoon. By late afternoon, Walter had managed to pull several large stones free from the lower section of the wall. Behind them, a narrow, dark space appeared, barely visible. Walter crouched beside it. Cool air flowed faintly from the opening. Atlas immediately pushed his nose toward the gap. Walter laughed softly. "Easy, boy." He leaned forward and pressed his hand into the space. The air inside felt colder than the canyon, and damp. Walter froze. He pulled his hand back slowly. "Well," he whispered, "that's something." Atlas gave a quiet bark. Walter stood and stretched his sore shoulders. The sun had begun to sink behind the canyon rim. Long shadows filled the passage. Walter studied the opening again. 3 feet wide at most. 5 feet tall if he cleared more rock. It would take days, maybe longer. Walter lifted the hammer again. One more strike echoed across the canyon, but the light was fading quickly now. Walter lowered the hammer. "That's enough for today." Atlas looked disappointed. Walter smiled. "We'll get there," he said. They walked back toward the truck as the sky turned deep orange over the mountains. Walter's muscles ached with every step, but something inside him felt different. The same feeling he used to get on patrol when a trail finally began to make sense. He glanced back once more at the canyon entrance. Behind that wall of stone, the faint whisper of water was still waiting. And tomorrow, they would break more rock. Tomorrow turned into another long day beneath the red stone walls of Devil's Throat Canyon. Walter Boone arrived just after sunrise again. The air was cool and carried the faint smell of dust and dry sage drifting down from the hills above. The narrow canyon was still wrapped in shadow, and the rockfall at the far end waited quietly where he had left it. Atlas ran ahead the moment Walter stepped out of the truck. The dog moved with purpose now, not curiosity. Purpose. Walter noticed the difference. "Yeah," he said softly as he followed. You already know something's back there. Atlas reached the rock fall and began sniffing the opening Walter had cleared the day before. His tail moved slowly from side to side. Walter set down the sledgehammer and stretched his shoulders. Every muscle in his body still ached from the previous day's work. His hands were wrapped in fresh bandages beneath the leather gloves. "Let's keep going," he muttered. The hammer rose. The steel head struck stone again. The canyon rang with the sound. Hour after hour, Walter chipped away at the rock. Large stones had to be levered loose carefully so the entire wall wouldn't collapse on top of him. Atlas stayed close. Sometimes the dog stepped back to a safe distance. Other times, he circled the base of the rock fall, watching carefully as if guarding the work site. Late in the morning, one of the larger stones shifted suddenly. Walter barely had time to jump aside before it slid loose and crashed to the ground. The sound echoed violently through the canyon. Dust filled the air. Atlas barked sharply and ran toward Walter. "I'm all right," Walter said quickly. The dog stopped a few feet away, studying him. Walter brushed dust from his shirt. "That one almost got me." Atlas wagged his tail once, but stayed alert. Walter looked at the gap again. It was wider now, 4 feet across, and deeper than he had expected. Cool air flowed steadily through the opening. The scent had changed too. The air smelled damp, not like dust, like wet stone. Walter crouched and peered inside. Darkness filled the narrow space beyond the rocks. Atlas pushed forward beside him and sniffed the opening eagerly. "Easy," Walter warned. The dog ignored him. Atlas slipped his head through the gap, then his shoulders. Walter grabbed his collar instinctively. "Hold on, soldier!" Atlas stopped halfway through the opening, but didn't back out. Instead, he stood there, perfectly still, listening. Walter leaned closer. He could hear it clearly now. The same faint sound. Water, moving slowly somewhere beyond the rock. Walter smiled slightly. "Well, I'll be." He stood and lifted the hammer again. The next 2 hours were the hardest work yet. Walter chipped away at the surrounding stones until the opening grew large enough to crawl through. The final rock came loose with a heavy crack and rolled down across the canyon floor. Dust drifted through the air. Walter stepped back and studied the gap. 5 feet high now, wide enough to pass through sideways. Atlas didn't wait. The dog slipped through the opening immediately and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Walter grabbed the lantern from his pack and lit it. "Atlas!" he called. A single bark echoed from somewhere deeper inside. Walter ducked through the opening. The narrow passage beyond the rockfall curved slightly to the left. The walls pressed close on both sides. Walter moved slowly. The lantern cast long shadows against the damp stone. Atlas's nails clicked softly ahead of him. After about 50 feet, the passage widened suddenly. Walter took another step, then another, and then he stopped. The lantern light spilled outward into a wide open space. Walter stared. Before him stretched a hidden valley, a natural basin surrounded completely by towering red cliffs. The walls rose hundreds of feet straight up toward a thin strip of blue sky far above. Sunlight spilled down through the opening, illuminating the valley floor in warm, golden light. Walter stepped forward slowly. Atlas ran ahead into the open space. Grass grew across the ground, real grass, not the dry, brittle weeds that covered the hills outside. Green, alive. Walter's boots sank slightly into dark soil. He walked farther into the basin, the lantern hanging forgotten at his side. The air felt cooler here, moist, alive. At the far end of the valley, something sparkled in the sunlight. Walter walked toward it slowly. Atlas reached it first. The dog lowered his head and began drinking. Walter finally saw what it was. A spring. Clear water flowed from a narrow crack in the cliff wall. The stream spilled gently over a smooth red stone shelf and collected in a shallow pool before disappearing into the soil below. Walter knelt beside Atlas. He cupped water in his hands. The water was ice cold, colder than snowmelt. He drank. The taste was pure, clean. Walter laughed quietly. "Atlas," he said softly. The dog lifted his head. Water dripped from his muzzle. Walter looked around the hidden valley again. Green grass, moist soil, fresh water flowing steadily from the stone. A place completely hidden from the outside world. 40 acres of useless rock. That's what everyone had said. Walter shook his head slowly. "No," he whispered. "Not useless." Atlas wagged his tail. Walter sat back on the grass and looked up at the narrow strip of sky above the cliffs. For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. The sound of the spring filled the valley, a steady, quiet music. Walter finally spoke. "Well, partner," he said, "I think we just found something nobody else knows about." Atlas barked once, and the hidden valley listened. The sound echoed softly off the tall red cliffs that surrounded the basin. It rolled across the grass and faded into the steady murmur of the spring. Walter Boone remained kneeling beside the water. For a long moment he didn't move. He simply watched the stream spill from the narrow crack in the rock wall. The water flowed with calm certainty, as if it had been doing this every minute of every day for hundreds of years. Atlas finished drinking and shook the cold droplets from his fur. Walter dipped his hands into the pool again. The water was so cold it stung his fingers. But it felt real. Real in a way that was hard to explain. Walter stood slowly and turned in a slow circle. The basin stretched nearly 400 feet across. Grass and low wild plants covered the valley floor, nourished by moisture that had no business existing in a place surrounded by dry desert mountains. Juniper trees clung to the edges of the cliffs. Sunlight filtered down from the narrow opening above, like a spotlight shining on a hidden stage. Walter exhaled slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like Uncle Sam wasn't crazy after all." Atlas trotted around the basin, nose close to the ground. Every few seconds he paused to sniff the air or investigate a patch of grass. Walter watched him. The dog moved with the confidence of a place already claimed. Walter walked back toward the entrance passage. The narrow tunnel through the rockfall looked smaller from this side. A person could pass through it, but a horse couldn't. Not yet. Walter leaned against the stone and studied the valley again. If anyone in Dry Creek discovered this place... The thought stopped there. Walter shook his head. "No," he murmured. "Not yet." He had spent enough years around people to know how quickly something valuable could disappear once too many eyes found it. Walter walked back to the spring. Atlas had stretched out in the grass beside the water, his eyes half closed as the cool breeze moved gently across the basin. Walter sat down beside him. For the first time in a long while, the tension in his shoulders loosened. The quiet here felt different from the quiet of his trailer. The silence of the valley wasn't empty. It felt alive. The water kept flowing. Walter leaned back on his hands. "You know something, Atlas?" The dog lifted his head. "This place might just be the best piece of land in Idaho." Atlas wagged his tail once. Walter chuckled. "We're not telling anyone," he added. The dog blinked slowly. Walter stood again and began exploring the valley. The soil beneath the grass was dark and rich. When he dug a small handful from the ground, it held together with moisture. That alone would have shocked most ranchers in Dry Creek. Walter walked toward the cliffs. The stone walls held pockets of moss where water had trickled down over the years. Small plants had taken root in cracks that captured sunlight for a few hours each day. It was a hidden garden, protected from wind, protected from drought. Walter returned to the spring. He studied the way the water flowed into the shallow basin before disappearing underground again. If he carved a small channel, the water could run across the valley floor. Irrigation. The thought came naturally. Walter hadn't farmed much in his life, but he had spent years fixing irrigation pumps and cattle troughs for ranchers around Dry Creek. Water changed everything. Walter glanced toward the tunnel entrance again. If he widened the rock fall, a horse could pass through, maybe even a wagon. Atlas suddenly stood up, his ears lifted. Walter looked toward the entrance as well. For a moment he thought he heard something, but it was only the wind moving faintly through the tunnel. Walter relaxed. "Easy," he said softly. Atlas settled down again. The afternoon passed slowly. Walter spent hours examining the valley. He walked every corner of it. He studied the sunlight, the slope of the land, the path the water might follow if he guided it. By late afternoon, the shadows had begun creeping across the grass. Walter stood beside the spring one more time. The water never slowed, never paused. It simply continued its quiet journey out of the mountain. Walter shook his head in disbelief. "All this time," he whispered. Atlas came to stand beside him. Walter rested a hand on the dog's neck. "You found it," he said. Atlas leaned into him. The trip back through the tunnel felt strange. Walter ducked through the narrow opening and stepped into the canyon again. The air outside felt dry and dusty compared to the cool valley behind him. Walter pulled a few loose stones into place near the opening. Not enough to block it, just enough that someone passing through the canyon might overlook it. Atlas watched carefully. Walter brushed dust from his hands. "That'll slow down curious eyes," he said. They walked back toward the truck. The canyon walls glowed deep red as the evening sun slid across the sky. Walter stopped once more near the canyon entrance and looked back. From here, the rockfall appeared exactly as it had before. A dead end. A useless pile of stone. Walter smiled slightly. "Let them keep thinking that," he murmured. Atlas jumped into the truck as Walter climbed behind the wheel. The engine started with a familiar rumble. They drove slowly back toward Dry Creek. The sun dipped behind the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the sky with deep orange and purple streaks. Walter kept glancing at the horizon, but his thoughts remained inside that hidden basin. Grass, soil, water. Walter shook his head again. After 20 years of drifting through life, he had accidentally found something worth building. Atlas rested his head against the truck door. Walter glanced at him. "You did good today," he said. The dog's tail thumped against the seat. Walter looked back at the road ahead. Tomorrow he would return. There was work to do. And for the first time in many years, Walter Boone felt like the future might actually be waiting for him somewhere. Spring passed quietly in the Bitterroot foothills. Walter returned to the hidden valley almost every day. Sometimes he arrived at dawn, when the canyon still held the cool breath of the night. Other days he worked until the sun dropped behind the red cliffs and the sky turned violet over the mountains. The work was slow, but it gave his days a rhythm. First he widened the passage through the rockfall. The sledgehammer echoed through Devil's Throat Canyon again and again. Walter chipped away at the stone carefully, making sure the opening was stable enough to pass through without bringing the entire wall down. Atlas supervised every step. The dog stood close whenever Walter lifted the hammer, occasionally barking if a rock shifted in a way Walter hadn't noticed. Once a large slab slipped unexpectedly and tumbled toward Walter's leg. Atlas lunged forward instantly. The dog slammed his shoulder against Walter's knee, knocking him backward just as the rock crashed to the ground where he had been standing. Walter lay in the dust for a moment, stunned. Atlas stood over him, tail stiff and ears forward. Walter laughed breathlessly. "All right," he said, sitting up. "You win again." The dog wagged his tail once, satisfied. By early summer, the passage had widened enough for Walter to walk through upright. Cool air always greeted him on the other side. The hidden basin felt like a different world. While the land outside baked under the dry Idaho sun, the valley remained green. Walter dug narrow irrigation trenches from the spring using a shovel and a pick. The water flowed easily along the shallow channels, soaking the soil across the basin floor. Soon, small patches of vegetables began to grow. Tomatoes, beans, potatoes. Nothing fancy, but enough. Walter built a small cabin against the eastern cliff wall, where the morning sun warmed the stone. The structure was simple: 4 sturdy posts, rough-cut boards, and a small stone fireplace. Atlas claimed the shaded spot beside the doorway as his personal post. From there, he could watch the spring and the passage through the rock. Walter slept better inside the valley than he had in years. The nightmares still came sometimes, but the quiet sound of the spring seemed to soften them. The water moved steadily through the night, a calm whisper that reminded him he was somewhere safe. By late July, the grass inside the basin had grown thick and green. Outside the canyon, the land looked very different. The first sign came when Sawyer Creek slowed. The creek ran through the center of Dry Creek Town and had watered the nearby ranches for generations. But that summer, its flow dropped lower than anyone could remember. By August, the smaller streams were gone entirely. Walter noticed the change immediately. Dust hung constantly in the air above the valley. Grass outside the canyon turned brittle and yellow. The wind carried the smell of dry earth everywhere. Walter drove into town one afternoon to buy nails for the cabin roof. Dry Creek looked tense. Men gathered outside the feed store, speaking in quiet voices. Ranch trucks moved slowly through town, hauling empty water tanks. Walter stepped into the diner. Earl McGrady sat at the counter beside 2 ranchers Walter recognized. "Afternoon, Walter," Earl said. Walter nodded. "What's going on?" one of the ranchers answered. "Creek's nearly dry." Walter frowned. "How bad?" The man shook his head. "Bad enough." Another rancher leaned forward. "Lost 12 head already this week." Walter ordered coffee and listened. The drought had arrived fast, too fast. Wells across the valley were running shallow. Pastures were turning to dust. The ranchers were starting to haul water from neighboring counties. Walter drove home in silence that evening. The sky was pale and cloudless. Dust rolled across the fields like drifting smoke. Atlas watched the horizon from the truck seat. Walter turned the truck toward Devil's Throat Canyon. The canyon mouth looked exactly as it always had: dry, silent, unwelcoming.
But Walter knew what waited inside.
They stepped through the passage and entered the hidden basin. The difference was immediate. Cool air, green grass, and the steady sound of water flowing from the spring. Walter walked to the pool and crouched beside it. The water poured from the rock just as strongly as it had the day they first found it. Not slower, not weaker. The drought outside had not touched it. Atlas drank deeply. Walter ran a hand through the cold stream. "Well," he murmured, "that's something." Days passed. The drought grew worse. Dry Creek became quieter as ranchers spent their time hauling water instead of visiting town. Walter stayed mostly inside the hidden valley. He expanded the irrigation channels, reinforced the cabin roof, and planted more vegetables. The spring continued its patient work. Water flowed day and night. Then one morning in early September, Atlas began barking. Walter stepped out of the cabin. The dog stood near the passage through the rockfall, staring toward the canyon. Walter walked over. "What is it?" Atlas barked again. Footsteps echoed faintly through the narrow canyon beyond the rock. Walter froze. Someone was approaching. Atlas moved in front of him instinctively. Walter stepped closer to the opening. The footsteps grew louder. Then a voice called out from the canyon. "Hello?" Walter recognized it. Pete Dawson, a cattle rancher who owned a small spread east of town. "Anybody out here?" Walter looked down at Atlas. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like we're about to have company." And the drought outside the canyon had just brought the first visitor to the only place in the valley where water still ran. Walter Boone stood beside the narrow opening in the rockfall and listened. The footsteps grew clearer, boots scraping gravel. Slow, careful. Someone was making their way deeper into Devil's Throat Canyon. Atlas stepped forward until his shoulders blocked the passage. His ears stood straight, his body alert but controlled. Walter placed a hand lightly on the dog's back. "Easy," he murmured. The footsteps stopped. A moment later, a voice echoed through the canyon. "Walter?" Walter leaned closer to the opening. "Pete?" Pete Dawson appeared in the narrow canyon passage beyond the rockfall. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, and dust covered his boots and jeans. He looked exhausted. Walter studied him carefully. Pete had always been a strong man. He ran a modest cattle operation east of Dry Creek, and he usually carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the land. But now his shoulders sagged. His eyes looked tired. "What are you doing out here?" Walter asked. Pete hesitated. Then he stepped closer. "I was hoping to find you." Walter glanced down at Atlas. The dog hadn't moved. "Looks like you did," Walter said. Pete wiped sweat from his forehead. "You heard about the creek?" Walter nodded. "Word travels." Pete sighed heavily. "It's worse than folks are saying." Walter waited. Pete leaned against the canyon wall. "My well ran dry 3 days ago," he said quietly. Walter felt a knot tighten in his chest. Pete continued. "Lost 15 head already." The canyon fell silent again. Walter looked toward the hidden passage behind him. Atlas turned his head slightly, watching Pete with calm attention. Pete rubbed the back of his neck. "I know this place is yours," he said. "But I saw the water trough you built out front." Walter had built it just weeks earlier. A small wooden trough fed by a narrow channel he had carved through the rockfall. Water from the spring trickled into it slowly before spilling onto the canyon floor. Walter had built it mostly for passing wildlife.
He hadn't expected people to find it so quickly. Pete looked at him.
"I filled 2 barrels this morning," Pete said quietly. "Didn't know if that was all right."
Walter shrugged. "Water's there."
Pete nodded slowly.
"I'll pay for it." Walter shook his head. "Not today." Pete looked surprised. Walter leaned against the rock beside the opening. "How many cattle you got left?" Pete sighed. "Maybe 40. Walter thought for a moment. Then he said something Pete clearly hadn't expected. "Bring them here." Pete blinked. "All of them?" Walter nodded. "The canyon's got enough grass for a while." Pete stared at him. "You serious?" Walter glanced at Atlas. The dog was watching him quietly. Walter turned back to Pete. "Serious." Pete's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Walter, I don't know what to say." Walter waved a hand.
"Say you'll help fix fences when this drought's over." Pete laughed softly for the first time that day. "You got a deal." Pete filled his barrels again before leaving. He paused once at the canyon entrance and looked back. "You know," he said, "a lot of folks thought this place was worthless." Walter chuckled quietly. "Still looks that way from the outside." Pete nodded. Then he drove away. 2 days later, another truck arrived. Then another. Word spread through Dry Creek faster than Walter expected. The canyon with the useless rock wall had water. Soon ranchers began arriving with empty tanks and thirsty cattle. Walter didn't argue. He simply built a larger trough in the outer canyon and ran a longer channel from the spring through the rockfall. Atlas supervised everything. The dog stood near the water trough as if guarding it. Most of the ranchers recognized Walter. Some of them had laughed when he inherited the land. Now they avoided his eyes. One afternoon, a large black truck rolled into the canyon. Walter recognized it immediately. Dale Whitaker stepped out. Whitaker owned the largest ranch in the valley, nearly 4,000 head of cattle. He had also been the loudest voice in town when people joked about Walter inheriting a useless hole in the rocks. Whitaker approached slowly. The heat hung heavy in the canyon air. Atlas stepped forward and stood beside Walter. Whitaker stopped a few feet away. "I need water," he said. Walter nodded. "There's the trough." Whitaker glanced toward it. Several ranch hands were already filling tanks nearby. Whitaker looked back at Walter. "I heard this spring runs year-round." Walter shrugged. "So far." Whitaker studied him for a moment. Then he sighed. "I guess I owe you an apology." Walter didn't answer. Whitaker rubbed his chin. "Truth is, I figured that land would drive you crazy just like it did your uncle." Walter leaned against the canyon wall. "Maybe it did." Whitaker laughed quietly. "Well, it saved my cattle." He reached into his pocket. Walter raised a hand. "Keep it." Whitaker frowned. "You sure?" Walter nodded toward the thirsty cattle waiting outside the canyon. "Just take what you need." Whitaker hesitated. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "You're a better man than most of us, Walter." Walter looked down at Atlas. The dog's tail thumped softly against the ground. Walter smiled faintly. "Nah," he said. "Just got a good dog." Whitaker glanced at Atlas. The German shepherd stood calmly beside Walter, his amber eyes watching everything. Whitaker nodded. "Well, looks like that dog saved the valley." Walter scratched behind Atlas's ear. The spring continued to flow quietly behind the stone wall, and for the first time in the history of Dry Creek, the town finally understood the value of the land everyone once laughed at.
For weeks, the canyon never rested. Trucks rolled in and out of Devil's Throat from sunrise until long after the sky turned black. Ranchers filled water tanks.
Cattle crowded near the trough Walter had built in the outer canyon. Dust rose into the hot air and hung there like smoke. Walter Boone moved through the long days quietly. He never charged anyone for the water. Instead, he asked for something different. "Help keep the channel clear," he would say. Or, "Fix that fence line before the cattle wander too far." And people did. Men who had once avoided him now nodded respectfully when they passed. Atlas watched everything. The German shepherd moved along the canyon edges like a silent ranger. He checked the water troughs, the cattle, the narrow passage through the rockfall. Nothing slipped past him. Walter had never seen the town work together like this, but by late September, the land still had not seen rain. The sky stayed pale and empty. One evening, the air changed. Walter noticed it first while repairing a wooden gate near the canyon entrance. The wind had shifted, cooler, restless. Atlas lifted his head from the shade and sniffed the air. The dog's ears twitched. Walter looked toward the mountains. Dark clouds were forming beyond the Bitterroot ridges, low, heavy, rolling slowly toward the valley. Walter wiped sweat from his brow. "Storm's coming," he murmured. Atlas stood up. The first thunder rolled across the mountains an hour later. By sunset, the sky had turned nearly black. Ranchers hurried to gather their cattle from the canyon floor. Trucks rumbled away toward the open road. Walter remained behind. The wind was rising now, pushing hard against the canyon walls. Atlas stayed close beside him. "Let's get things secured," Walter said. They walked through the narrow rock passage into the hidden valley. Inside, the basin still looked peaceful. The spring flowed steadily. Grass moved gently in the growing wind. Walter tied down the roof panels of the cabin and secured the small irrigation gates he had built earlier that summer. Thunder cracked again. This time it was much closer. Atlas barked sharply. Walter looked up. Rain began falling. At first it was light, but within minutes the sky opened. Rain poured into the canyon like a waterfall from the heavens. Walter stepped out of the cabin doorway and watched. For months the land had begged for water. Now it was getting more than it could handle. The narrow canyon outside began channeling the storm water downhill like a rushing river. Walter's stomach tightened. Too much rain could be just as dangerous as none. "Come on," he said to Atlas. They moved quickly toward the rock passage. Walter stepped out into the canyon. The wind howled between the cliffs. Rain hammered the stone walls so hard it sounded like gravel hitting metal. Water rushed down the canyon floor in muddy streams. Walter scanned the area. A small group of cattle still lingered near the trough. "Damn," he muttered. They must have wandered back after the ranchers left. Walter hurried toward them. Atlas ran ahead, barking sharply to push the animals away from the narrowing canyon. Lightning flashed overhead. Thunder followed instantly. The cattle panicked. They surged forward, hooves slipping on the wet ground. Walter grabbed a fallen fence rail and waved it to guide them toward the open exit. "Move!" he shouted. Atlas darted behind the herd, barking again. The animals finally began moving in the right direction. But just as the last calf passed the canyon bend, a deep cracking sound echoed above them. Walter looked up. A section of the canyon wall was breaking loose. Years of dry rock and sudden rain had loosened the stone. The cliff face groaned. "Atlas!" Walter shouted. The dog ran toward him instantly. The rock slide came down in seconds. A massive slab crashed onto the canyon floor. Walter shoved the last calf forward and turned.
but the ground beneath him shifted.
A falling rock struck his shoulder and knocked him down. Dust and rain exploded into the air. Walter tried to move. Pain shot through his ribs. Another rock slammed down beside him. He was trapped. Walter struggled to breathe. Mud and debris pinned his legs beneath the fallen stone. The storm roared above him. For a moment, he could barely hear anything except the pounding rain. Then, Atlas barked. The dog appeared through the swirling dust. Atlas rushed toward Walter and began digging frantically at the mud and loose rock. Walter coughed. "Easy, boy," he rasped. But Atlas didn't stop. The German shepherd clawed at the debris, throwing mud and gravel aside with desperate strength. Rain continued pouring down the canyon. The water level rose quickly around them. Walter tried to move again. Pain burned through his chest. He couldn't free himself. Atlas barked again, louder, over and over. The sound echoed down the canyon toward the distant road. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. The storm raged above them. But Atlas kept digging, kept barking, kept fighting the mud and stone. Because somewhere, beyond the canyon walls, someone might hear him. And Atlas had no intention of leaving his wounded friend behind. The storm hammered Devil's Throat Canyon without mercy. Rain poured from the dark sky in thick sheets. Water rushed down the canyon floor in muddy waves, swirling around the rocks that had trapped Walter Boone beneath them. Walter struggled to breathe. Every inhale sent sharp pain through his ribs. The weight of the stone pinned his lower body against the wet ground. He tried to move again, but the rock refused to shift. "Easy, easy," he whispered to himself through clenched teeth. Atlas continued digging. The German shepherd clawed furiously at the mud and gravel, throwing debris behind him. His paws were slick with rain and dirt, but he never slowed. Walter forced his head up. "Atlas, stop!" But the dog ignored him. Atlas barked again, loud, desperate, echoing through the narrow canyon like a warning siren. The sound carried far, farther than Walter could see through the rain. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. The storm blurred time into something shapeless. Walter's vision flickered as he fought to stay awake. Atlas barked again, and again. Then, another sound answered. Engines. Distant at first. Walter blinked through the rain. Headlights appeared around the canyon bend. 2 trucks pushed slowly through the rising water. Walter heard voices shouting over the storm. "Over there! By the rock slide!" Pete Dawson jumped out of the first truck before it even stopped moving. "Walter!" Atlas barked louder and ran toward the men before turning back toward Walter, guiding them through the debris. Pete slid down the muddy slope beside Walter. "Hold on," he said quickly. 2 other ranchers followed him, their boots splashing through the water. One of them whistled when he saw the rock pinning Walter's legs. "That's a big one." Pete grabbed a shovel from the truck bed. "Then let's move it." The men worked fast. They shoved mud aside and pried smaller rocks away from the slab. Atlas stayed beside Walter the entire time. The dog pressed his body against Walter's shoulder, as if trying to shield him from the rain. Walter managed a weak smile. "You found help," he murmured. Atlas wagged his tail once. A steel jack appeared from the back of one of the trucks. The men wedged it under the rock. "Ready?" Pete asked. They pushed together. The jack groaned under the weight. Slowly, inch by inch, the rock lifted. "Now!" Pete shouted. 2 men dragged Walter free from beneath the slab. Walter gasped as blood rushed back into his legs. Pain exploded through his body. But he was alive. Pete helped him sit up against the canyon wall. "You stubborn old fool," Pete muttered, shaking his head. Walter coughed weakly. "Had cattle to move." Pete glanced at Atlas. The dog stood beside Walter, drenched and breathing heavily. Pete nodded toward him. "Your dog's the one who saved you." Walter looked down at Atlas. Mud covered the dog's legs. A deep cut ran across his shoulder where falling stone must have struck him earlier. Walter reached out slowly and touched the dog's neck. "Good boy," he whispered. The storm began easing as quickly as it had arrived. By the time the men loaded Walter into the truck, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle. Atlas jumped into the back seat beside him. The headlights cut through the darkness as the trucks rolled slowly out of the canyon. By morning, the news had spread across Dry Creek. Walter Boone had been nearly buried alive during the storm, and his dog had saved him. But that wasn't the only story people were talking about. The rain that had caused the rock slide had also filled the dry creek beds. Water ran through the valley again. Not enough to end the drought completely, but enough to give the ranchers time. And the spring in Walter's hidden valley had never stopped flowing. By afternoon, nearly the entire town had gathered near the canyon entrance. Walter sat in the bed of Pete's truck, his ribs wrapped tightly in bandages. Atlas lay beside him, his shoulder stitched but healing. Ranchers stood quietly along the canyon road. Dale Whitaker stepped forward. "We talked about it this morning," he said. Walter looked up. Whitaker nodded toward the canyon. "That spring saved every ranch in this valley." He gestured behind him. Several trucks rolled forward carrying lumber, fencing wire, and metal piping. "We're building a proper water line," Whitaker said. Walter frowned slightly. "A what?" Pete grinned. "A system," he said, "to carry water from your spring down to town." Walter looked around. Men were already unloading tools. Someone started marking the ground where a road could be widened through the canyon. Walter shook his head slowly. "You don't have to." Whitaker raised a hand. "Yeah," he said, "we do." He looked at Atlas. "That dog saved your life." Then he gestured toward the valley behind them. "And that spring saved ours." Atlas lifted his head as if he understood. Walter leaned back against the truck bed. For a long moment, he watched the people of Dry Creek working together in the canyon he had once believed belonged only to him. Now it belonged to something bigger. A community. Walter reached down and scratched Atlas behind the ears. "You hear that, boy?" he said softly. The German shepherd thumped his tail against the truck, and the valley that had once been hidden behind a wall of stone had now become the heart of an entire town. Autumn arrived slowly in the Bitterroot Mountains. The first frost dusted the grass outside Dry Creek one quiet morning, and thin ribbons of fog drifted along the hills as the sun climbed above the ridgeline. But inside the hidden valley, the grass remained green. The spring still flowed. It always had. And now, thanks to months of work by the people of Dry Creek, the water no longer stayed hidden. A narrow gravel road had been carved carefully through Devil's Throat Canyon. Metal pipes ran alongside the canyon wall, guiding the steady flow of the spring down toward the ranches and homes scattered across the valley floor. Walter Boone walked slowly along the path that followed the stream. His ribs had healed well enough that he no longer needed the heavy bandages Pete had insisted on wrapping around his chest after the storm. The scar still ached on cold mornings, but Walter didn't mind. Atlas walked beside him. The German shepherd had aged a little over the past year. The dark fur around his muzzle had begun to fade into gray, and the deep cut across his shoulder had left a thin white scar beneath his coat. But the dog still carried himself with quiet strength. Walter paused beside the spring. The water still emerged from the narrow crack in the rock wall, exactly as it had the day they first discovered it. Clear, cold, patient. Walter crouched down and dipped his hand into the pool. The water felt the same. He smiled faintly. "Still working," he murmured. Atlas stepped forward and drank. The dog always checked the spring first whenever they arrived. Walter often joked that Atlas still believed the water might disappear if he stopped watching it. A voice echoed faintly through the canyon behind them. "Mister!" "Boone?" Walter stood slowly and turned. A young woman stepped carefully through the narrow rock passage. She carried a small camera bag and a notebook tucked beneath one arm. Walter had seen her truck parked near the canyon entrance earlier that morning. "You the reporter?" Walter asked. She nodded with a friendly smile. "Emily Carter, Boise Chronicle." Atlas watched her calmly, but stayed close to Walter's side. Emily glanced around the valley. The green grass, the small cabin, the irrigation channels Walter had built months earlier, all of it seemed to surprise her. "This place is beautiful," she said quietly. Walter shrugged. "Just a patch of dirt with a spring." Emily smiled. "That's not what people in town say." Walter scratched the back of his neck. "Well, towns like a good story." Emily stepped closer to the spring and knelt to take a photograph. "Everyone in Dry Creek told me the same thing," she said. "They said the town would have lost half its ranches if this water hadn't been found." Walter leaned against a nearby stone. "Maybe." Emily looked up at him. "So how did you find it?" Walter didn't answer right away. He looked down at Atlas. The old German shepherd had stretched out beside the spring, resting his chin on his paws while the water murmured quietly beside him. Walter smiled. "I didn't." Emily blinked. "You didn't?" Walter shook his head. "That dog did." Emily looked at Atlas again. "You're serious?" Walter nodded. "He heard it." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Heard what?" Walter looked toward the rock wall where the water flowed from the mountain. "The water." Emily waited. Walter looked out across the valley. The late afternoon sun had begun sliding down the tall canyon walls, painting long golden lines across the grass. "It was behind that wall of stone," he said, "sealed up tight." He pointed toward the passage where the rockfall once blocked the way. "I figured the land was worthless." Emily scribbled a quick note in her notebook. "But your dog knew better?" Walter chuckled softly. "He kept digging at that wall for days." Emily looked impressed. "So he saved the town?" Walter shook his head gently. "No." He looked down at Atlas again. "He saved me." The dog lifted his head slightly when he heard Walter's voice. His tail tapped once against the grass. Emily lowered her pen. "What do you mean?" Walter watched the water flowing through the valley. "For a long time," he said slowly, "I didn't think I belonged anywhere." The breeze moved softly through the grass. Walter continued. "War does that sometimes." Emily remained quiet. Walter glanced at Atlas again. "But that dog kept pulling me forward." He smiled faintly. "And one day, he pulled me right here." The sun dipped lower behind the cliffs. Atlas stood and walked toward Walter. Walter rested a hand on the dog's head. Emily closed her notebook gently.
I think people are going to love this story, she said. Walter shrugged. Story's simple. He looked down at Atlas again.
The old German shepherd blinked slowly in the warm evening light. Walter scratched behind his ears. Dog heard water. The spring continued its quiet journey out of the mountain. Atlas lay down again beside the stream. Walter sat beside him. For the first time in many years, the silence around him felt peaceful. And the man who once believed the world had forgotten him finally understood something simple. Sometimes the path back to life begins with nothing more than a loyal dog and the faint sound of water moving patiently through stone. If this story touched your heart, let us know you were here. You can simply comment 1 if you believe a loyal dog can change a man's life, or comment 0 if you've ever had a dog who stood by you through the hardest days. And if you'd like, tell us where you're watching from tonight. Our community loves seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because the next story is already waiting. Another journey of loyalty, courage, and the quiet bond between a veteran and the dog who refuses to leave his side. Until the next story.